Are we doing it like this? Are we doing
Oh
it
my
like
God.
this?
I'm like kind of happy because she's like doing outreach
Yeah.
and she doesn't always do that. I don't want to discourage her immediately.
Oh, sweet girl.
Oh my gosh. Okay, Ash. You're a goodie. You're a goodie. Yes, you're a goodie. Okay. You're so gross. Okay, off. You're being really passive aggressive.
Okay. Oh, actually, I think we were going for part of that.
Okay, good.
Welcome to the Empowered Curiosity podcast. Today's kind of an exciting and different way of recording because we are outside. I'm here with my friend Shannon Beahen, and she is the founder, all the things of Humming Horse. And I'm just gonna let you take a few minutes to introduce who you are, and then I'll
Mhm.
sort of give a little bit of context for where we are and why we're doing it like
Great.
this.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're going to introduce everyone to where we are, but this is my place on Vancouver Island. We've got three horses with us, one of which I think you can see their bum right now. Um, but my work involves, I work one-on-one with other horse people
Mhm.
and their own horses to help improve their relationships
Mhm.
between human and horse. So while I do have this beautiful place with these beautiful horses, my work takes place off property. So we can say I'm an alternative horse trainer very generally, but even that is kind of morphing. It's human animal relationship
Yeah.
energetics.
Yeah.
We might very generally say is kind of my scope of practice. Um, I have a further academic background that looked at a lot of questions around the philosophy and politics of human animal interactions, the philosophy and politics of the body, and the philosophy and the politics of language.
Mhm.
And all those things come together to help me, you know, uh, raise questions
Yeah.
around these types of relationships and attempt to have some answers, but of course it's always morphing.
Mhm.
So I have that academic background, I have the soft skill background at the relationship level, and of course also a background in what we might call sport horse or elite level type riding,
Mhm.
which I no longer do so much, but it does inform some of the energetics and how I interact with horses.
Lovely.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, one of my favorite things about you
Mm-hmm.
as just a person and as somebody who's a guide on people's journeys with their relationship with horses is after I have a conversation with you, I feel like I end up with more questions than I have
Mm.
answers, and I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I get that that's not for everybody
Yeah.
because a lot of times we want things to be so concrete
Yeah.
and we forget that actually there's beauty in the nuance and
Yeah.
there's like so much learning in the nuance. And so I'm just here to say I love the questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know that something you understand is like, so it's never just questions existing in the abstract, and I'm very invested in solidifying knowledge as well,
Hmm.
So I work with the energetics in the relationship of humans and animals. And of course, when we're talking about the energetics, it's beyond language.
Hmm.
It's of course feelings,
Hmm.
and it's very dynamic.
Hmm.
And so I enter into that with the horses,
Hmm.
but I'm also very invested in letting that be kind of a, if we dare call it, like a pure state of observation and feeling, but then of course moving that up the scale of like
Yeah,
concretizing
material.
yeah, into the material, and like kind of a halfway point in that materiality would be thought forms and
Yeah,
being able to name the phenomena that are happening.
yeah.
And so me as like even a language scholar helps me do this because I
Hmm.
can attempt to, and even a poet in
Hmm.
my background, like poetry in my background, I can, because when we're talking about energetics, rational language doesn't always capture it, and it has to be the kind of dynamism of a poetry or a poetics
Hmm.
that attempts to solidify it. And then beyond the poetics, I do attempt to systematize it
Yeah.
so that it can be taught.
Yeah.
Because I'm also interested in pedagogy,
Yeah. Yeah.
like, because I'm not just observing animals, and I'm some kind of wildlife observer. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
would love that, but I'm also trying to translate back to the human world and to
Yeah.
my own students. Um, so that it can be meaningful for them.
Yeah.
So it's always kind of this process. And I think this is where we speak that similar language
Yeah.
of like moving from the energetic and the felt sense
Mm-hmm.
into like creating forms, thought forms, language forms of that, and then
Mm-hmm.
eventually like practical
Yeah.
actions that others who might not have experienced these subtle energetic states can make sense of it. But
Absolutely.
then, of course, we receive these feedback loops from our clients
Mm-hmm.
or even from the animals with these solidified
Yeah.
forms. And we go, oh, you know what? I might need to tweak that language a little bit
Mm-hmm.
because while it might be a word or an idea or concept that makes sense for me, how is it being received,
Yeah.
in a more popularized
Yeah.
sense? And so getting that feedback from our clients, tweaking it, bringing it back to the animals, trying on. So just that back and forth loop is something that interests me so much. And it's like modern day mysticism
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
packaged as a bit tied to the very like crass or crude idea of a service offering.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
what could be further removed? Like mysticism, service offering,
Yeah, I know.
and yet trying to do it and be sincere about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Before we get too far in, I just want to share that if you're listening to this via a podcast audio version of it, we're going to put this up on YouTube. And if you want to watch the YouTube version, we've got the horses just wandering around, hopefully at some point in the background.
There's a bum.
We've
There's a
got a
dappily bum
yeah,
in the background.
we've got Ivan's butt right there.
Yeah.
So um, I'm sure they'll flow through when they feel
Hmm.
like they want to hang out with us.
Yeah.
So, if you are listening to this on audio, there's a video version, and you get to see the animals that we're talking about here. Um, so, you and I were having dinner yesterday,
Mm.
and it's been so lovely to be able to just hang out with you and connect with the land and how you're fostering the land and how you're interacting with the horses. And as somebody who's fairly new in the horse world and trying to, you know, uh, gain a deeper and I want to say more ethical understanding of relationships,
Hmm.
not just with horses, because I also want to keep in mind that a lot of the people who are listening to this, some of y'all might be horse people,
Hmm.
and please go check out Shannon's work
Hmm.
if you are. But even if you're not a horse person, I feel like even before I got to have my own little herd to experiment and play with,
Hmm.
I was following your work because you were talking about these broader concepts
Hmm.
that aren't just about horse human relationships. They're really about just relationships generally.
Yeah.
And we sort of went down this like beautiful rabbit hole. I wish we had the mic on last
That's
night over
always the
dinner.
case.
But we went down this beautiful rabbit hole talking about consent
Yes.
and what that can look like. And of
Mm.
course, your framework for consent is between human and animal.
Hmm.
My framework for consent is between practitioner and client,
Hmm.
is, sort of the way we were chatting last night.
Hmm.
And I think that might be an interesting place to
Mm.
play just because it's going to, I mean, I think everyone who listens to this podcast is very much into nature,
Mm.
very much into animals,
Mm.
and we all want to be participating with nature and animals in consensual ways
Mm.
that is about reciprocity
Hmm.
and less about taking and hierarchy and control and
Yeah.
dominance and force,
Yeah.
and how that line can actually look really tricky
Yeah.
a lot of the times,
Yeah.
you know? And so I think when I feel into this, I want to start by just you as a language scholar riffing on this concept of the words consent
Mm.
and sovereignty.
Mm. Yeah. favorite topic, one of my many favorite topics. Um, so first I'll say, just for a little bit of context, for anyone that maybe hasn't had a lot of experience with horses, one of the grand things about working with horses, especially in terms of, if we dare say something like relational experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
And we're coming to this with a lens of curiosity,
Mm-hmm.
not just you and I in this conversation, but in our
Yeah.
practices.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like my work with horses is always giving me answers about how to be in better relationship with the world at large, with my body, with my dog, with other people. And one of the things that I think that is unique about horses, for those that might not have had experience with horses, is there's a very kind of pure energetics to them. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, what do you mean by that pure energetics, Shannon? We could even like encase that in the idea of them being like historically a prey animal,
Mm-hmm.
with a high flight drive,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's one of their evolutionary survival mechanisms,
Yeah.
is their primary thing is
Mm-hmm.
like they can run.
Yeah.
And as such, there's a very like, uh, what's the opposite of viscous? Like a
Mm.
very fluid reactivity
Yeah.
to them that creates what I call, like, I'm always kind of looking at feedback
Yeah.
loops, right? Because if we're in relationship, I
Mm-hmm.
mean that word gets used a lot, but relationship for me always mentally is like interbeing,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not just, we're not in the singular mode, or what I've called like object oriented thinking
Sure.
versus relationship oriented thinking.
Sure.
Relationship is about the in between,
Mm-hmm.
the back and forth, the feedback
Mm-hmm.
loops. I do something, what effect does it have on you?
Mm-hmm.
Cause and effect,
Yeah.
that effect in turn creates some kind of energetics that comes back on me, so on and so forth, gets
Right.
compounded,
Right.
right? So with horses, if we're going to dare talk about them as like a medium of relational experimentation, not to you make them a utility thing, but
Mm-hmm.
like this is one of the joys of working with them, is this type of experimentation. They give very immediate feedback
Mm-hmm.
on energy,
Yeah.
right? On how you present to them,
Mm-hmm.
what you bring to them. So they're, I would even liken it to like a clay sculptor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've ever seen some of these videos that go around virally. They're the kind that kind of entrance me, of someone just working on
Yeah.
the
On the wheel.
wheel,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you're watching the object like morph and change
Mm-hmm.
in this like liquid form. So horses in like the mammalian world, I've never worked with a gazelle, they'd probably be even more electric. But in the mammalian world, like this is like, wow, the
Mm-hmm.
way we can observe those feedback loops. So that's the first thing I want to say, is like
Yeah.
there's this very fluid energetics to horses, versus, let's like compare that to the human world. And and I will get to this idea of consent and
Yeah.
sovereignty, but I'm kind of setting up first the idea that the moment we even think about consent and relationships,
Mm-hmm.
we want to be aware of these feedback loops,
Yeah.
these back and forth, question
Absolutely.
and answer. Can I? Yes, you can. Can I? No, you can't. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
no, I can't. Now what? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, oh, so in the human world, that kind of feedback loop gets a little more viscous, right? It's a little bit heavier because
Mm-hmm.
it's complicated. Now,
Mm-hmm.
why is it more complicated? In a very simple sense, we could say language,
Yeah.
right? Language makes it more complicated, but also our language, there's some, I don't want to say dishonesty that happens at the level of language, but sometimes what we might be thinking and languaging through our human conditioning has divorced us from the feelings.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for there to be
Yeah.
incongruence between the thought and the word and the body and the
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
sensations. So to even like scale up what I'm talking about, this pure energetics with the horses, and then taking some of those lessons and trying to apply them to the human world, immediately there are some obstructions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they take place very simply. I mean, there's more than just language, but that's one location, and of course, thought forms where we might kind of be aware that things get complicated.
Yeah.
So, what's some of the solution to that? Well, like, fortunately, some of the solution, we're already peeking into it as trauma informed practitioners
Mhm.
because, what is some of the best trauma informed frameworks telling us, if
Mhm.
we didn't already know this from our mystical lessons in nature, is we need to get into the body.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's the somatics
Mhm.
of how we're experiencing life.
Mhm.
And so, um, to speak more directly to this idea of consent, I think that's the first thing we want to be aware of
Mhm.
is that if we were to do a poll right now, just of like the average person and what's your idea of consent, what does that mean?
Mhm.
It's usually a linguistic utterance.
Yeah.
And that linguistic utterance is yes or no.
Right.
Do I give consent in the affirmative or do I not?
Right.
And it's like in the moment of that declaration, there's even like a legal pronunciation
Yeah.
being made.
Yeah.
And so we're already so locked into these heavy things, this hard yes,
Mhm.
legal implications, no, legal implications, cultural implications, political
Right.
implications, heavy, heavy, heavy
Yeah.
in terms of the comparison to the energetic feedback
Exactly.
of horse.
Exactly.
So I guess to begin by complicating, when we talk about consent, complicating that a yes or a no aren't that simple.
Mhm.
And that even if they were very clearly uttered
Mhm.
at the level of language, there's a time component.
Mhm.
How long is that yes valid?
Yeah.
By the time it's locked in as law, you sign your signature on a waiver or on a contract, your yes is now solidified.
Right.
And we'll come back and remind you of that if you change your mind.
Right.
And it's like, what about when our own yeses and nos are not congruent with how we change through time?
Yeah.
So I'm still not even talking about what I learn immediately with the
Yeah.
horses, but this is what I've learned is
Yeah.
that there's already a discrepancy between what yeses and nos mean in the natural world
Mhm.
and what they mean in the human world. And we might identify some of those differences as one that is more mutable,
Mhm.
one that is less mutable. And
Yeah.
in the human world, like you are locked in
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
not even be able to change your mind.
Yeah.
So I'll maybe
Absolutely.
pause there before I go further with these yes
Yeah,
nos
because
to see
there's a
how that
couple of
lands.
things that I want to just like highlight and play with there. For me, the things that come up, just to bring it into the material, because I think you've been in sort of like energetics.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things that I do with my clients is help them identify a feeling and then help them identify where that feeling exists in their body and what that sensation is.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd be so surprised, at least, when I started doing this, I was so surprised that oftentimes when I ask people, what is the feeling and where does it live in your body?
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's just like a literal question like that,
Mm-hmm.
they go into very heady
Yeah.
type words.
Mm-hmm.
It feels confusing. It feels really chaotic. It feels, you know, I feel angry about it. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard to root it into physical sensation. So that
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely like the first
Mm-hmm.
layer of doing this work around consent
Yeah.
is being able to identify, if we're going to be really broad strokes, again, we're talking like, I love how you outlined that of like it's so binary in the human world,
Yeah.
is if we're going to start in the binary and that's where most people are starting,
Yeah.
let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
So what does a yes feel like in your body? What does a no feel like in your body?
Mm-hmm.
And then from that place we can layer in nuance.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm hearing you say, which I've also observed just interacting with humans
Mm-hmm.
as well as animals in the natural world, is it's a moment by moment shifting, evolving landscape.
Yeah.
And in a world where the human brain likes to have very concrete answers and very solid answers,
Mm-hmm.
we want to be put into the binary of yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're actually doing in that moment is anytime we put something in the binary in our minds, we're putting our nervous system into the sympathetic,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, just in that, we are eliciting a form of a threat response and
Mm-hmm.
responding from a threat response.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we introduce from the mind level, okay, so there can be nuance in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There's maybe a bit of gray.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a no now, and as I feel safer and safer, it might shift into a yes.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to like take your beautiful
Mm-hmm.
poetry and
Mm-hmm.
put it into the material world of
Yeah.
like this is how we see this in action in the
Yeah.
material space.
Well, I love that too. And even you talking about like sometimes when you prompt clients for these questions, that it does get heady. And it has occurred to me in the past that maybe we're not, like maybe as trauma informed practitioners, one thing that would be well advised, and especially with me coming from the energetics of horses,
Mm-hmm.
to start coming up with, or like adding to the feedback loop into the collective, more vocabulary around the types of sensations
Yeah.
of consent.
Yeah.
So, for example, what comes to mind for me is like expansion,
Mm-hmm.
contraction,
Yeah.
stiffening, bracing,
Mm-hmm.
opening, um, fluid,
Mm-hmm.
sticky.
Mm-hmm.
Like these are the felt sense descriptors
Mm-hmm.
of yes and no.
Yeah.
So I know one of the things we were talking about last night, and it's very much the types of things I'm teaching my clients to be aware of. So I'll back up for a moment. I'm noticing more and more people in the what I'll call with quotation marks the ethical horse space
Okay.
becoming aware of this concept of consent.
Yeah.
So thrilled,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'll sometimes get stories like this from people where they will say, "Yeah, I work consensually with my horse," and I think in my head, "Great,
Mm-hmm.
that's so good." And they'll say, "Yeah, I asked if I could ride them, and they said no, and so I respected that, and so we don't
Walked away.
ride."
Yeah.
Yeah, and so um, I love the impulse there. Like I
Mm-hmm.
love the um, desire to honor the horse's wishes. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to discourage people from doing that.
Yeah.
But it's this idea that the finality of the no.
Yeah.
Now I realize like that's a good thing. You're listening. You're trying to interpret what the horse is saying and you're trying to honor their wishes. But there's the potential that in honoring the finality of the no, it's the end of the relating.
Yeah.
And what's to say, we talked about the example yesterday of like, I go for therapy
Mm-hmm.
and I am asked a question by my therapist
Mm-hmm.
and I start to break down.
Mm-hmm.
And I might even say to them, I don't want to talk about
Yeah.
that. That might just be layer one
Yeah.
of what I'm hoping this professional can penetrate through.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to encourage people to ignore other beings' no's, but to maybe be on alert to this, as you say, this moment by moment shifting,
Mm-hmm.
and what other things might be we be alert to beyond just the concreteness of yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only the bodily
Mm-hmm.
words of openness, contraction, stiffness, bracing, flowing,
Yeah.
supple. Um, it's not just being aware of that, but it's even the actual feeling sense.
Mm-hmm.
So with my own clients with the horses, it's like, okay, so you ask them to maybe move on.
Mm-hmm.
They don't move.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty clear no.
Yeah.
Is that the end of the conversation? Well, what if we just accept it for the moment?
Mm-hmm. That's okay. I just let it bulk a little bit.
And wait and see what shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And usually, what I advise clients to do in the waiting is getting your body.
Yeah.
Because that's something too that, like, as we're asking for yeses and nos or
Mm-hmm.
negotiating permissions with the other,
Yeah.
what's happening with us?
Yeah.
Sometimes in wanting something from the other, we're coming up and outside of
Yeah.
ourselves. And even that in itself is causing false no's
Yeah.
or false yeses.
Yeah.
But it's often the false no from this energetics of you've already kind of abandoned your own self. So
Mm-hmm.
what that looks like in an interaction with a horse is, like I say, you ask the horse to move on. This is a very common thing for you non-horse people. Like that's humans want to get the horses moving. They're
Yeah.
beautiful moving creatures. We ask them to move. They don't move, they say no. I teach my clients, honor that in the moment.
Mhm.
Don't be a dominator. Don't get excessively pushy. Don't be a low grade nagger. Don't be a micromanager. But also, that doesn't mean end of the conversation.
Yeah.
Back to the therapist idea, like
Yeah.
they ask you a question, that first layer of your trauma reaction says no.
Mhm.
Imagine if in that moment the therapist walked up and leaves and said, "Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
you said no. Okay, I'll respect that.
Yeah.
I'm gone." Where do we go from there? We'd only ever be skimming on the surface with
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah.
So we have to have brave enough beings. These are the like healers and therapists and counselors or horse trainers, ethical horse trainers of this world. Brave enough people that can be reading into the superficial layer of yeses and
Mhm.
nos, honoring it, holding space for it, but also holding space for that to change.
Yeah.
Because behind this idea of a yes or no is as if there's this fully self aware being on the inside with no competing urges,
Mhm.
with perfectly aligned urges and desires that are all known to ourselves. In philosophy, we call it like self sameness,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
If you're self same, you're entirely known to yourself, you're an enlightened being. Most of us are not that.
Yeah.
We are a mix of
Definitely.
competing urges,
Yeah.
of yeses and nos. Maybe my stomach is saying, yeah, I want that donut.
Mhm.
Maybe my blood sugar levels are saying, no, you should not have
Yeah.
those. Got a little yes no going on with the horses in the background. So imagine having, I think it's great that the popular conversation about consent is now one that we even have this word on the
Yeah.
table and that we are attempting to honor various beings' yeses and nos.
Mhm.
But I guess what I'm trying to identify here is that there's a potential missed opportunity
Yeah.
if we concretize that yes or no into a
Yeah.
finality. And that as, people in a therapeutic mode with other beings, it's really important to get past those superficial layers of whether it's a trauma response or programmed conditioning. Is that the fear
Yeah.
saying no? Um, and would we miss out on deeper relating
Yeah.
if we didn't have trained professionals that could sensitively
Yeah.
excavate beyond those superficial layers
Mhm.
of yes or no?
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that this is where information becomes crucial
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of times, actually, I can sort of put this into the context of a relationship with my horse Jessie,
Mm,
is she's had a history of being a show horse.
mm.
She was, her owner told me that she's got all these fancy, buttons and tricks and can do anything on
Push
her.
button is
Yeah.
what they tend to call it. Yeah.
And what I found from her energy is she is so tired of being micromanaged.
Mm,
And so my role right now in this like first month that I've had, been playing with her
mhm.
is really just giving her information that I'm not going to micromanage her.
Yeah.
And so, we can translate that into human to human dynamics, practitioner client dynamics of
Mhm.
like when you're going out there and putting marketing out there, for example,
Mhm.
how clear are you about information of what they're actually saying yes and no to?
Mhm.
Because right now, what Jesse is saying no to from me is writing,
Mhm.
and I'm completely honoring that right now.
Mhm.
But she just thinks of writing as being this black and white situation,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So she thinks if I jump on her back, then I'm going to micromanage her. I'm going to kick her. I'm going
Mhm.
to do all these things to her body that she doesn't want to do. So she's saying no to all of that.
Yeah.
But the conversation isn't over.
Mhm.
The conversation right now is can I give you enough information so that you feel safe enough to say yes?
Yeah.
And that's really what I think about when I am supporting my clients with how do you market,
Mhm.
you know and really the conversation is less about are you giving value to your clients, the way that a lot of
Mhm.
other business coaches will tell you to this is what you need to do.
Mhm.
My question is how safe does your audience feel
Mm.
with you,
Mhm.
and from that safety can you invite a yes?
Yeah.
And also in that, giving them the option of no and
Mm-hmm.
making sure that they know that even if it's a no
Mm-hmm.
to working with you,
Mm-hmm.
that you aren't going to shame them, blame them,
Mm-hmm.
manipulate them, gaslight them. I
Mm-hmm.
can't tell you how many times I've had my clients come to me and say, you know, I really couldn't afford working with X, Y, and Z coach. And they told me, you know, oh, you just have to imagine that the money is there.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
this is such a pervasive conversation in the coaching
Mm-hmm.
world of like, just imagine that the money is there and live your life like the money is there. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, have you tried doing that? It's going to put you into scarcity.
Yeah.
It's going to put you into a threat response.
That's the word that was just
You
floating
know?
around in my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if we can look at these concepts, and I love horses because you're right, like they are such fluid teachers. They're a
Mm-hmm.
constant mirror back and forth
Mm-hmm.
of like how your nervous system is doing.
Yeah.
Just the same way I look at my clients and I'm like, you guys are all a mirror for, you know, how our relationship is.
Yeah.
And so it's about prioritizing the relationship
Yeah.
and not about pushing an outcome or a process or a system
Yeah.
or a whatever agenda it is that you have
Yeah.
onto another sovereign being
Yeah.
who has agency and
Yeah.
who their birthright is to own that agency.
Yeah. So one of the phrases I use in my teaching, or one of the principles I use, is never put pressure into brace. And
Mm-hmm.
so to translate that for non-horse people, pressure is kind of the generalized term we use for the energy that we use to ask a horse to move.
Mm-hmm.
So pressure, and then pressure gets politicized in the horse world as a bad thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm like, well, we could give it another name because pressure sounds pretty pushy.
Mm-hmm.
But let's even just say the energetics of volition,
Yeah.
right? So if you're putting like an ask,
Mm-hmm.
and you can map this back to the marketing experience or the client service offer experience, um, we're so accustomed to pushiness. We're
Yeah.
so accustomed to operating in this culture in threat response, and
Mm-hmm.
that's where like the grind is where it happens.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just even these outdated market, free market ideas of like survival of the fittest. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
hearing this new term go around now. Might have been Tara Brock I heard saying this. She was quoting someone else whose name I can't recall, but survival. No, no, it's not survival of the fittest. It's survival of the nurtured. And it's like, hell yeah, it is. It's in safety
Mm-hmm.
where expansion happens.
Mm-hmm.
So back to this idea of us being so accustomed to, so I teach students, don't put pressure into brace.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the horses are, so brace meaning like resistance,
Yeah.
physical resistance,
Yeah.
which fortunately in a horse is very readable.
Mm-hmm.
So if you start to adopt this as a practice for all things, and it's really just a physics,
Yeah.
so if there's resistance, you don't add more push.
Mm-hmm.
You're typically gonna get push back.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the same question, and I'm saying question where else I might say the ask,
Mm-hmm.
like the pressure,
Mm-hmm.
like I'm going to ask the horse to move, I'm going to apply pressure when there's not brace.
Mm-hmm.
So still the same question, but it's a difference of timing.
Yeah.
Their body is now open, and you ask, they might now say yes
Yeah.
to the same thing.
Yeah.
Here another energetic example. If you've ever used a rotating door. You go into
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
big hotel or
Yeah. Yeah.
something, and there's those rotating doors. If you've ever been in a rush and you try to make them move faster, because they work by like air pressure, I
Yeah. Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
if you try to make it go faster than it is physically capable of going,
Mm-hmm.
it will go slower.
Mm-hmm.
The door will move even slower than it would have if you just
Yeah.
let it be.
Yeah.
So I guess we might modify this yes no binary of consent to one of entering into the relational energetics
Yeah.
of opening and closing,
Mm-hmm.
passivity,
Yeah.
sometimes the asker being in the mode of passivity,
Mm-hmm.
which we've all been taught nothing happens in the passive mode.
Yeah.
Quite incorrect.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
Sometimes what your passivity will do is neutralize the other being's brace,
Yeah.
and in neutralizing their resistance,
Mm-hmm.
an opening happens.
Mm-hmm.
And now not only might, we've got a
I
horse here,
got mystery.
fortunately she's gentle. um, Not only might they then be willing to say yes to your question, but in fact, they might even come seeking you
Yeah.
for the thing and you don't even have to ask the question.
Yeah.
So, one quick thing here, the actual etymology on consent
Mm-hmm.
is to feel together.
Really?
Like the
Love
answer
that.
is right there in the word. The definition might be something about giving permission and permission being expressed as a yes or no, which is a
Mm-hmm.
linguistic utterance. But if you look into the history of the word, it's telling you it's to feel together,
Yeah.
feel for those openings, feel
Yeah.
for those closings.
Yeah. I just wanted to share that I got to see this in practice yesterday
Mm,
because, the horses were sort of out of this little enclosure that you had, and it was time for them to come back. And I went to go collect Ivan, and, being new at this type of relating with horses and having been and sort of going through like my logical brain of like, how do you get a horse to move?
mm,
And so I threw a rope over Ivan's neck and
mm,
tried to lead him back into the enclosure. And you were
mm,
like, no, 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 don't do that.
mm.
Because he was resisting me. There
Yeah,
was a brace. And, I was like, well, how do you get this? He's like a 1,500, 1,800 pound animal
yeah,
to move,
yeah.
right? And I'm also putting my own personification of like, I wouldn't want to go back into the enclosure
Hmm.
where I can't eat, you know,
Beautiful grass.
beautiful grass
Yeah,
anymore. And, you very beautifully just came up from behind him and clicked and
yeah,
did some like little motions with your hand, and he just went
yeah,
along his way.
yeah.
And so I think that that's where the skill
Hmm.
comes in.
Yeah,
Again, taking the esoteric into the material form
yeah,
is my intention is not to try to force Ivan into an enclosure he doesn't want to go into,
yeah,
but the reality of the situation is he does need to go.
yeah.
And so how can we hold space for that
Hmm.
and ask it in a way that is skillful?
Hmm.
And I think that this is where the experienced practitioner is different from somebody who's just out of like their coaching certification program,
Hmm.
is you start experimenting with people.
Hmm.
And the beautiful thing about energetics is it's quite forgiving actually.
Hmm.
We're so worried
Totally. Yeah.
about fucking up,
Hmm.
messing up, not getting it perfect.
Hmm.
My experience with energetics is we mess up.
Hmm.
And as long as there's effort put into how do we repair that rupture,
Yeah.
instead of just glossing over it,
Yeah.
acknowledging the thing that went wrong, acknowledging, hey, I wasn't quite as skilled at that,
Yeah.
acknowledging, like that was a great learning lesson for me,
Hmm.
and let's move on.
Yeah.
Like those ruptures can be repaired.
Yeah.
And I think that people are so scared to do the wrong thing that they end up not doing anything at all.
Yeah.
And that can actually be more harmful
Hmm.
than somebody who is out there with an open heart, with curiosity, whether you're relating with horses or dogs or
Hmm.
humans, like
Yeah.
doing it with compassion for yourself and compassion for the other person or the other
Yeah.
spirit, whatever you're working with.
Yeah, what's coming to mind for me is, and even going back to this example that you just used with Ivan
Hmm.
yesterday. And so, like, okay, so on the practical level, what did I come in and change? Okay, so you were doing something very normal
Hmm.
with horses
Hmm.
and not by normal standards excessively invasive or aggressive. You had a rope around his neck and you were asking him to move, and you
Hmm.
were being very respectful and polite about
Hmm.
it. But the difference is, and just so the audience understands, I work mostly with my horses at liberty.
Hmm.
Meaning, it's not that I never put a control device on them, like a halter on their head or a rope on that halter or a saddle on their back I actually do rarely put a bit in their mouth.
Hmm.
I'm very minimalist with the equipment I put on. And as time goes on and I enter more into the energetics, you don't need these cruder, like, we don't even need to talk about it as what is ethical or not.
Hmm.
I mean, we can. I enjoy doing that. And I think it's
Hmm.
important that we do talk about the ethics of control of another being's body. But when you're in the energetic mode, when you're in the felt sense mode, this is an amoral realm. you know, and that's not to say it's immoral.
Mm-hmm.
It's to say energetics has no ideology.
Mm-hmm.
It like either flows or it doesn't flow. And as you say, it's forgiving.
Mm-hmm.
It might violently restrict in one moment, and it also might violently open up and give way to a smoothness.
Yeah.
It's just up to us to all be aware of these
Yeah.
energetics. To also, I mean, I sometimes really like street language. Like, you're, you wrote a check with your mouth that your ass can't cash. And it's like, well, that's the energetics of like, if you're going to provoke something to a certain level, at
Yeah.
the energetic level,
Mm-hmm.
which me working with huge animals and wanting to work with them in a liberty mode where I'm giving their big bodies permission to explode,
Mm-hmm.
I better make sure I'm equipped and my nervous system is equipped to handle this big
Mm-hmm.
energy. So, yesterday, with the rope around his neck, the main kind of uh, correction I would say I made is I said, like, take the rope off of his neck.
Mm-hmm.
And we still asked him to move and
Absolutely.
ultimately kind of made him move.
Yeah.
But what we gave him was space,
Mm-hmm.
and we like physical space.
Mm-hmm.
And we changed the proximity of our body,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we gave him more space. We kind of went to a place in his body where he felt safer.
Mm-hmm.
I've learned from many horses it's the bum.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who's had an experience with horses, probably the first thing you were taught was don't get too close to the bum.
Right.
That's because they can kick you.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? If you're standing in the place where they can offer the most kind of threat to your body, they feel a little safer.
Yep.
So I play with a kind of ethics of vulnerability with
Mm-hmm.
my own human body
Mm-hmm.
around them
Mm-hmm.
to help make them feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I'm not so close that I could be kicked, but I tend to orient myself in a place around their body where they feel a little safer.
Yeah.
And as you saw with him, we gave a little wave of the stick and he moved on no problem.
Yeah.
So it's not perfect consent. We
Yeah.
didn't drop our agenda. We
Mm-hmm.
had an agenda of getting him to stop eating the grass and get him into his track system that he lives on. But in doing so in a just a slightly safer way for his body
Mm-hmm.
and in a way that allowed him to answer the question, can you move out of the grass area into the track area,
Right.
in a way that he wanted to answer that question.
Yeah.
So he had multiple ways
Yeah.
of coming up with a way to answer our question how he wanted to, instead of this very specific way that in the mainstream horse world we're taught to.
Right.
So I mean, you're the expert, but like, I can imagine how we might map that back to like marketing. Could
Yeah.
you give your client a little more space? Could you
Exactly.
ask a question in a way that there's multiple ways they can answer? I'll just quickly say, I know from my experience, even with your own BAM program,
Mm-hmm.
even something as simple as like consuming the learning content, feeling a little bit anxious, not even knowing that I was anxious, that like, oh, am I behind on lessons? And then hearing your sweet voice come on and say, by the way, finish this in your own time.
Mm-hmm.
And my nervous system just going, oh, thank God. And there was like twofold. Not only do I have more time now to finish this, but I have a teacher and a guide and a service provider who's already anticipating
Mm-hmm.
my potential block
Mm-hmm.
and has accounted for it.
Mm-hmm.
So that the safety feeling within that. So you still want your clients to finish the learning
Of
material,
course.
but you're
Yeah.
going to let them find their way through it in their own. So I have extra time now, I have extra space now,
Yeah.
and I have a teacher and a guide who is um, attuned to
Mm-hmm.
my potential
Mm-hmm.
blocks.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thanks for that feedback.
Yeah.
Um, I think the piece that I think is really important to name here is integration,
Mm.
because the thing that happened with Ivan yesterday, I love that we're breaking this, like the thing that happened in like 30 seconds
Yes.
down into like the micro nuances of
Mm-hmm.
what was actually happening under the surface, is when we are seeking integration,
Mm.
in our relationships, then we give that other being the space to integrate.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hearing you say is, for a horse, that space looks like physical space, and so that gave him like a way to hear the question of let's move on and integrate it and then answer it in his own way.
Yeah.
Which honestly, I'm like watching him walk. I know he can walk faster, and he's just going do 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 do, and I'm like, yeah, that's how he wanted to answer that question.
Yeah.
And also with clients, if I'm controlling and micromanaging and making sure that they're staying up on their homework and making sure, like every little piece of their thing, it's actually less about the client and more about me
Yeah.
and my need to control.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm learning in my relationship with horses, is all these subtle ways in which we're taught to control other bodies plays out so deeply in the horse-human relationship, and that allows for a lack of integration for both people in that relationship.
Yeah.
And so if we can set our sights on integration rather than focus on an outcome or a process, or like it has to look a particular way,
Yeah.
then that changes the conversation completely.
Yeah.
And there was another piece that I wanted to name here. I think I might have lost it though. I'm sure I'll come back to it, but go ahead.
What that brings up for me is that, and again, this is practical on the horse side, but on the marketing side or service offering side, what it means is how we phrase our questions might need to change. And what is meant by how you phrase a question might come down to, what's this idea of space might be in, do you have a technology for, let's say, your online course that allows for space for clients? So it comes down to looking at the, what might we call that? Like the infrastructure itself that is the container for the service offering.
Right.
And realizing that the infrastructure itself, as well as the phrasing of the question, already determine certain outcomes. And that in making that front end aspect, I mean, we might call it at a technical side back end, but like in how we phrase the question more robust, so that the other being we're trying to get yeses or nos from, so that it doesn't have to just be one specific yes or one specific no. They might answer it in different ways. For horses, that looks like changing the equipment I use with them. It means changing how their habitat is designed, because as you look into consent, especially with animals, but we can still apply it to domesticated humans, that much of how control takes place is already invisibly built into environments.
Yeah.
For humans, cultural conditioning, language, so it's loosening these things a little bit. I've designed spaces, or I attempt to design spaces with the horses where they can flow with their bodies in multiple different ways. I mean, it's so cliched in the business world. That phrase that came out in the early 2000s, like think outside the box. It got so overused, but there's such truth to that. So yeah, designing environments where the animals can give answers in more flexible ways, designing equipment where the animal can give answers in more flexible ways. Of course, me being in my own body in more flexible ways, and I imagine that maps back to all kinds of infrastructure in the service offering realm as well.
I think the thing that comes to mind is something that we were actually talking about yesterday, just as we were, hanging out, is when we get stuck in systems, in rigidity, it actually divorces the tool from the energy.
Yeah.
So, like using your idea of like you use less and less equipment, but you use your energy more and the relationship, and you trust the relationship more.
Yeah.
And you trust your intuition to know what needs to change in their environment, in how you're working with them, and to me, it's like when somebody comes in and they're like, well, I've done EMDR, I've done tapping, I've done acupuncture, I've done da 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 da, all
Mm-hmm.
listing off the like alphabet soup of modalities that are out
Mm-hmm.
there,
Yeah.
it's like, okay, so can we use those tools in a more flexible way?
Yeah.
So if you're a Reiki practitioner and you have herbalism training and you have acupuncture training and you're certified in coaching, it's like instead of getting dogmatic and stuck in one system,
Mm-hmm.
and I already feel that like bracing in my body as I say that,
Mm-hmm.
like, can we look at the entirety of your life and your experiences
Mm-hmm.
and not just think of these places where you've gotten these like specific certifications as the thing that is like the medicine?
Mm-hmm.
And can we look at your experiences as a whole and bring that into relating,
Mm-hmm.
and having known a little bit about your background of like you've done the sports horse world, you've
Mm-hmm.
done, these like high level competitive things. It's not like you left all that behind.
Mm-hmm.
You bring pieces of that in. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that I kind of want to turn the camera around so that we can
People
show
can see
people
this.
how cute Ivan is. How cute are you, Ivan? He wants to eat the stick.
Yeah, that's okay. If that's what you're into.
Okay, lovely listeners. I'm sorry, but we had to take a little bit of a break there because unfortunately, Shannon and I recorded a full episode yesterday, and then the last 20 minutes of it got cut off because my computer fritzed out. This is our first time recording outside, and I think it overheated. So we are going to do our best to, I mean, obviously, we can't recapture the exact magic that happened
Mm-hmm.
yesterday, but I wanted to just touch in on a couple of themes that we've been talking about and make sure that we flesh everything out. And
Mm.
so, thanks for coming back on for day two of
Yeah.
recording.
Yeah. Thanks.
hmm So, one of the things that happened actually after our recording that I wanted to just like bring a little bit of like light into and talk about in the context of consent
Mm.
is the role of the asker in being able to hold space and empathy
Mm-hmm.
as you're asking a question. And specifically, this came up around us discussing mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And I was asking her to move in a circle around me,
Mm-hmm.
which is a fairly basic move in the horse world.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that she kept turning in, like, and I can't remember the technical term you used, but something about dropping the shoulder.
Dropping the shoulder. Yeah.
Yeah. And so instead of, like, if you can picture, I'm trying to get her to do like a 360 circle around me, and she kept turning in so her head is coming back towards me.
Mm.
And we were discussing, all of the biomechanics that goes into a move like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it clicked for me that, like, horses are not meant to turn in such a tight circle, and you named that in such a beautiful way that I think that we can take this lesson from horse world and playing with
Mm-hmm.
horses and apply them to humans as well.
Yeah.
And the term that you used was somatic empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Is, can you
Mm-hmm.
put your felt lived sense into another creature, another human, another soul's body,
Mm-hmm.
and think about how that question might be landing for someone.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious about, like, as you are orienting yourself into another creature's, like, even just sort of like envisioning yourself in that space,
Mm-hmm.
how you hold your own boundary around that. Because I can imagine this conversation can turn into a bit of like empathetic entanglement in
A
a
hundred
way.
percent, and that's exactly it. And that's one of kind of the more nuanced areas I'm trying to clarify for my various audiences in this kind of niche space of, well, it's fortunately less and less niche, but the space of, empathetic or ethical horsemanship. So, yeah, like what you're naming about even the horizontality of the horse and the verticality of the human is the beginning of understanding how even just like it's world making. Like the understanding the world of another being is beginning to just even feel how they inhabit the world, and that their yeses and nos would come up differently,
Hmm.
not just as an expression, or a body signal, um, but that we first have to understand how they move through the world
Yeah.
to even be able to read these yeses and nos. So that's kind of under the category of, in animal talk, we talk about zoocentrism.
Okay.
So we've probably, a lot of us have heard of anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
So seeing the world from the perspective of the human mainly, or within human worlds, we even talk about ethnocentrism,
Okay.
seeing the world specifically from one culture's
Culture. Yeah.
perspective and
Yeah.
forgetting that there's other ways of understanding the world. So again, it just kind of highlights that before we can even get to this thing called consent, we first want to attempt to understand what that other being's world is like so that we're phrasing the questions properly. But you're right, it could turn into a type of empathetic entanglement. One of the traps that once you go down the rabbit hole of horse human or human animal ethics
Hmm.
is the potential danger of anthropomorphizing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've come across this term in your
Yeah.
now forays with
Yeah.
the animal worlds, and that is being careful to not impose human characteristics on the animal.
Hmm.
But I'm of a camp that says, like, this is empathetic bridge making. We can risk making mistakes
Hmm.
in this area. Plus, a lot of the time when people say that, it has to do with emotions.
Yeah.
And what we now know about nervous systems is that mammalian nervous systems, us as humans, mammals, the horses as also mammals, our dogs
Hmm.
as mammals, are very similar.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, in terms of, is the question partly like, how do we avoid some of that entanglement?
Well, I think it's a two-part question now that we're sort of like talking it through of like how do we like I feel like there's like a pendulum swing that can happen potentially here
Yeah.
of either somebody who is so self-centric that it's
Mm,
hard for them to jump into another person or animal's experience
yeah.
and really hold space for that in a really compassionate way,
Mhm.
and then the pendulum swing could be swinging too far to the other end
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and being like, oh, now I only identify and want to meet the needs of this
Yes, yes,
creature
yes.
and forget that I might have a boundary myself, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, so for me, and this is one of the things I actually teach in my current course, but
Mm-hmm.
it's just what I teach to students in general, or I
Mm-hmm.
attempt to teach, is, well, firstly, we're existing in the energetics in the
Mm-hmm.
system that I try to use,
Sure.
right? Occupying the felt sense, which requires us to first understand what it feels like to be in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And I've already lost track of whether we discussed this in the first part of the podcast or not, but like, before we go looking for yeses and nos from other
Mm-hmm.
beings, have we already left ourselves
Yeah.
in in pursuit of these yeses? It's usually yeses we want.
Yeah.
Have we already left ourselves? So more and more I'm trying to show students, like, yes, I have techniques that can help build better relationships
Mm-hmm.
with our animal others,
Mm-hmm.
but before I give you some of those techniques, let's first check in. If things are becoming dysregulated in the relationship, check in with yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we're very quick, even if we're not gaslighting our others, we might be over caring.
Yeah.
You know, I bring up in my course the idea of enmeshment,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of the more modern term for what we used to call codependency.
Yeah.
And I talk about an energetics
Mm-hmm.
and energetics of enmeshment and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
entanglement, which I think for many people that haven't really been taught to foster their own yeses and nos
Mm-hmm.
and their own autonomy and their idea of love or good relations is
Mm-hmm.
already confused with
Yeah.
blurred boundaries. Part of what I'm trying to teach is like, let's just keep coming back into ourselves, and this is my own
Yeah.
ongoing work,
Yeah.
but again with our very sensitive friends, the horses, we can keep reminding ourselves of this.
Mm-hmm.
So if we ask them to go for a walk on a trail ride, and maybe they've even said yes,
Mm-hmm.
but now things start getting funny. There's like a loud tractor coming by, or there's something that spooks them along the way, and now things are getting very dysregulated.
Mm-hmm.
The first check-in should be with oneself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I see a lot of, and I think this is what you might have been describing here in terms of that potential empathetic entangling,
Mm-hmm.
is when things start going wrong, there's excess concern for the other's nervous system.
Yes,
And
exactly.
that might seem like on paper, like that's a really good thing. What could be so wrong about caring for the other's nervous system? But at the end of our discussion that I think got cut off, I was talking about what a great nervous system, or how good it feels to be in the presence of your nervous
Mm.
system. And to me, more and more, that's where I'm starting to see a lot of the teaching transmissions come from.
Yeah.
It's that energetic modeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we can talk all we want from words, and I can even give all kinds of somatic, technical techniques
Right.
to students that
Right.
are all valid.
Right.
But there's also just the energetics of how the other beings we're around,
Mm-hmm.
how our nervous systems are talking to each other,
Yeah.
and what a profound transmission it can be to have a grounded nervous system
Mm-hmm.
for an ungrounded nervous system to be in conversation with.
Yeah.
So, yes, I'm aware of things like the potential dangers of anthropomorphizing, of imposing human views onto animals,
Mm-hmm.
even for good cause.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the ways we can, and of course, I'm talking anthropocentrism here, but we can have our own versions of that in the human world.
Yeah.
Me just assuming that other people experience the world the same way I
Yeah.
experience the world.
Exactly.
So I think the way we protect ourselves from that a little bit is like, if any of our others are dysregulating, the first check-in is with ourselves.
Yeah.
And am I in myself?
Yeah.
And what can I do a little more of to be in my body?
Mm-hmm.
For my
Mm-hmm.
students, the two quick check-ins are, can I connect with my breath? Can I feel my feet on the ground?
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, often when we do that, a lot of the issues with the horse start to resolve themselves. And some of that does require a little bit of physical spacing.
Mm-hmm.
For those beings that are used to a kind of codependency or enmeshment or an idea of love or care
Mm-hmm.
that is we've got a horse on the other side of the camera.
Hi.
A kind of love or care.
Mm-hmm. Hold on. Oh, hi, Ivan. Mm-hmm.
That is already entangled. So for me, it's creating that space. It's being first responsible for our own centeredness,
Mm-hmm.
which is even a kind of physics.
Mm-hmm.
With a rider, it would be like, have you lost your balance?
Right.
Are you riding around at a speed where you can't even keep your balance?
Right.
Then don't be surprised if the horse starts getting dysregulated.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
dysregulation was actually probably precursored by one's own loss of
Yeah.
balance. So again and again, the energetics of the horse are kind of teaching us where we need to be. And then once we are balanced and we are modeling a healthy nervous system, and of course we call that co-regulating,
Yeah.
right? Co-regulating requires the first being, the
Mm-hmm.
one that wants things to go better,
Mm-hmm.
to be
Yeah.
regulating. And then we share
Yeah.
that gift of regulation through an act of co regulation.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, we can speculate about what animal worlds consist of, and I love doing that, and I
Mm-hmm.
love naming things that are like the physics of their horizontality
Yeah.
versus our verticality.
Yeah.
But I think before we even need to go that far into it, it still comes back to this simple principle of, am I in my own body?
Yeah.
And I've watched you work with horses now, and you keep reminding me, like, I'm still somewhat new to this,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like the fact that you keep bringing your lessons of the nervous system to these animals. Yes, there's a few techniques and things, technical movements that will
Mm-hmm.
help you along your way, but you've already got like that big piece already. And from there, you'll be able to problem solve so many other things that might
Yeah.
come up.
Yeah.
Does that make sense
Yeah.
with what
And
you're asking?
thank you for that reflection. And it's actually something that Andre and I went out to dinner with Alicia,
Mm-hmm.
who's my assistant and also a student of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that we talked about yesterday, which is, you know, with traditional horse trading, which is, I don't quite know exactly what to call what it is that you do. And I think the
Mm.
closest we've come to is like soul retrieval for horses.
I like to say
um,
subtle energetics or horse human relationships,
yeah.
whatever that means.
But the thing that feels so different is a lot of times people look for a trainer
Mm-hmm.
because they think the horse is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, can you fix my horse so that I can ride the horse or do all these things with the
Mm-hmm.
horse?
Mm-hmm.
And what we've experienced
Mm-hmm.
is the the focus, because it is so nervous system centric
Mm-hmm.
and because it is so relational centric and co-regulatory centric,
Mm-hmm.
you have to address the person in that dynamic.
Yeah.
And you're actually doing the relationship between horse and human a disservice if
Mm-hmm.
you can't do that.
Yeah.
And, you know, for me, seeing analogies and metaphors everywhere
Mm-hmm.
in life, even just what we worked on yesterday
Mm-hmm.
with Mystery, which was, can you lead her
Mm-hmm.
without, or what, can you lead her with a lead rope
Mm-hmm.
and pretend like the lead rope isn't there,
Mm-hmm.
so that the invitation to follow
Mm-hmm.
is an energetic one, not a physical one,
Exactly.
you know. And then, you know, Alicia and I were talking yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and I sort of like came to me is, I'm very new at having an assistant.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, uncomfortable for me to release control,
Mm.
to not be leading her too crazily in one direction or another, because honestly, everything I've given her,
Mm-hmm.
she's handled beautifully and in her
Mm.
own
In
way.
her own way.
Exactly, which is
Yes.
sort of what we
What
were
we said
talking
with
about with
Ivan.
Ivan, you know.
Pose the question so that there's enough different ways that the answer come back and it still be an answer that satisfies the question,
Exactly.
but that the answer wasn't already predetermined in an absolute sense through the question.
Exactly.
So that, yes, we're not after pure consent. And I
Mhm.
always feel a bit guilty because I talk about consent and then I look at my techniques and I'm like, this isn't pure consent. And I don't know how we would get pure consent in domestic environments. And in fact, I think the moment you're in relationship with another being,
There's
pure
compromise.
pure consent is compromised
Yeah,
because pure consent would be a solitary entity floating with only their own desires, you know.
exactly.
So we might even need to come up with better terms.
Words,
You
yeah.
know, one of the terms I use is relational autonomy,
Mhm.
which involves,
Mhm.
you know, back and forth feedback
Yeah.
loops. But that's exactly it. Like this idea of, yeah, I still want something from you, from
Mhm.
my animal,
Mhm.
but can I do it in a way that doesn't collapse that other being out of their own
Yeah.
beingness, and actually in the process of getting, like, extracting from them what we want, we have to come so far outside of
Exactly.
ourselves.
Exactly.
And we see that with our own, like, leadership during this age of advanced capitalism. Like, no, I know very few people that would want to be a global leader. It doesn't look fun. I mean, we don't like the results of what they do,
Yeah.
and nor does living their life look fun
Yeah.
because it requires
Constant
constant
dysregulation.
yeah,
Yeah.
to keep other beings doing exactly what you want them to do
Yeah.
versus, you know, what you're talking about with this assistant, asking
Mhm.
and realizing they might have their own ways
Yeah.
of solving the problem.
And
Yes.
honestly, like, I hired her
Mm-hmm.
because I want someone to take over certain aspects of my business
Mm-hmm.
so that I can focus in on teaching and, you know, creating content and putting out offers and courses and things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, again, I think it's that like beautiful balance of inviting
Mm-hmm.
and giving space,
Mm-hmm.
and also recognizing when my own control wants to come in and play
Mm-hmm.
and where that control is coming from. And
Mm-hmm.
if I were to just focus in on the other,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's Alicia as my
Mm-hmm.
assistant or as, Mystery as the horse I was working on yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
we are not actually getting to the root
Mm-hmm.
of what's going on
Mm-hmm.
because the root is actually in me, you
Well,
know?
yeah, I mean, what the formula sounds like there is increases in desire for control
Hmm.
come from increased internal dysregulation.
Right.
And so the dysregulation comes up in us,
Hmm.
the hypothetical us.
Hmm.
We don't like that feeling.
Yeah.
Even as, trained professionals in trauma informed
Yeah.
frameworks, it's a
Yeah. Yeah.
constant education.
Yeah.
The dysregulation comes up in us, and still the impulse is to control the outside world.
Yeah.
And actually, like, this is where some of the best, most high functioning people are victims of their own success
Hmm.
because they can be potentially very good
Hmm.
at controlling that outside
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
But it's this internal life versus the external.
Yeah.
So it's like checking in. Oh, there's that need for control. And this comes up for me. I used to be a mainstream trainer.
Yeah.
I used to use aggressive techniques,
Hmm.
violent techniques,
Yeah.
even. They were very normalized. They
Hmm.
still are very
Yeah.
normalized. So I actually have that in my repertoire.
Hmm.
I know how to make that work.
Hmm.
It's its own internal tyranny,
Hmm.
and it's effective.
Yeah.
That's why it's out there.
Yeah.
And so, but I'm always kind of more impressed by the beings that actually are in touch with that tyrannical shadow side, with their own sense of power, with
Hmm.
their own sense of control.
Hmm.
They know how to wield it,
Hmm.
and they're doing the work to integrate that in a healthy way
Yeah.
versus some beings that I think are kind of promoting an ethic of kindness, but that ethic of kindness is coming from almost a divorcing
Yeah.
of their own shadow
Yeah.
self. So I'm not trying to make this a right or wrong, but just to kind of notice when that urge for control, and I mean, even the fawn response is
Hmm.
its own form of
Absolutely.
control,
Absolutely.
appeasement,
Yeah.
right? And so whether we're doing it the nice guy way or the I know how to make you move way,
Yeah.
whether it's an assistant or whether it's a horse, I know how to control you, I know how to move the players on the board. In either case, the answer still is, ooh, there's that feeling again,
Hmm.
either the internal tyrant or the internal appeaser, the internal fawner, and go, let's just like pause. And again, just to wrap this up, I'm remembering what I was going to say from my course that I teach. I teach the rule of 50-50.
Hmm.
And it's getting into a felt sense of you and I are in relationship. We're even conveniently sitting here with even a convenient line in between us, a microphone, a tree, a horse. So it's getting a felt sense for efforting.
Hmm.
There's a boundary between us
Hmm.
energetically, and so there should be.
Hmm.
And it doesn't mean that boundary can't ever be crossed. That's what consent is.
Yeah.
Hey, come on over.
Yeah.
Yeah, great, I want to come on over. But there should always still be this presumption of this energetic, I don't just have access to you or any other being because I want it. It should be
Hmm.
negotiated.
Hmm.
And so to remind ourselves that when we're going looking for that connection with the other, to only come to our 50%.
Hmm.
And I mean, in some cases, I might even back off less than 50 if it's a being that's got to be kind of recuperated, like therapeutically brought back
Hmm.
from some kind of traumatic event. I might
Yeah.
not even give 50. I might hold way back
Yeah.
and give them lots of space and wait to see when they are ready to even come up to
Yeah. Yeah.
this
Yeah.
line. And so it's not just an idea, this idea of the rule of 50-50. I've got my 50%, you've got your 50%, we meet in the middle. That's an egalitarian consensual relationship.
Sure.
And of course, we know it's actually something more like
Yeah.
this. But even if we use that as a starting point, and I think when we start to tune into that, and again with the horses, it's a very physical thing.
Hmm.
When we start to tune into that, we realize a lot of us are coming way over.
Yeah.
And some of just staying on our side is sometimes even just a timing thing.
Hmm.
Like I'm a chatty person. I have to remember sometimes just like, pause a second before the next person answers.
Yeah.
I know to do that with horses.
Hmm.
And I know to wait actually several beats
Hmm.
between a question and their answer.
Mhm.
But this idea of 50-50, whether it's a timing thing, whether it's a, ooh, here's me coming up and out of myself, I'm so up in that other being's business.
Mhm.
And to just recognize, oh yeah, okay, there I am.
Yeah.
Come back in
Yeah.
and wait.
Yeah.
Wait for that other being to start showing up.
Yeah.
And you saw that with Mystery
Mhm.
2 days ago
Mhm.
when it was like, how long do I wait? Because some
Mhm.
people, when I say wait, they just think it's an arbitrary, like, oh, be patient. I get it. Yeah, yeah. Be patient. Slow
Mhm.
down.
Mhm.
It's like, it's not just an arbitrary instruction. Slow down generally. Be patient generally. It's how long do you slow down for? You slow down till the other being starts coming online
Yeah.
and they come looking for you.
Yeah.
Any woman who's like played the dating game knows this to some degree. He hasn't texted you back yet. Chill
Yeah.
out. Don't
Yeah.
send 10 texts
Yeah. Yeah.
before he's even sent one.
Mhm.
So the rule of 50-50.
Yeah. And I love that. And I think that, not having had a chance to take your course yet,
Mm-hmm.
like I know that what you're gonna put out there and into that offering is not just technique.
Mm-hmm.
It really is about how do we a focus back in on yourself, your own sense of maybe literal balance,
Mm.
emotional
That's
balance,
it.
energetic balance,
Yeah.
and from that place, can you find a relationship with another being, whether it's a horse or another human or a dog?
Mm-hmm.
I find that these lessons are applicable even with, 5 pound Ruby,
Totally. Yeah.
and so like if we start looking at these things as portals that we can walk through
Mm.
to, I've had this, I've talked about it pretty openly on my podcast of like all the reasons why my traumatized past has caused me to rely on control as a survival
Mm.
tool.
Mm-hmm.
And from that place, it's like I've seen myself over the years trying to control my partners, trying to
Mm.
control my surroundings, trying to
Mm-hmm.
control, even in the height of my dysregulation in grad school, controlling the very look of how my notes looked.
Wow.
And some might deem that to be quote unquote OCD.
Yeah.
I now know that was actually a survival pattern.
Survival strategy. Yeah.
And so seeing it come up in horses who are such ready and willing mirrors
Mm-hmm.
of this, and I'm trying to be really careful of not thinking of a relationship with the horse as a therapeutic one, because I
Mm.
don't want it to be coming from a place where I'm asking the horse to do yet another service for us
Yeah.
when it has been doing it for generations and generations and
Yeah.
generations.
Yeah.
But the reality is that when we're in a co-regulatory reciprocal relationship with another being,
Mm-hmm.
there is a form of service, but it goes in both directions.
Yeah.
And so if we can sort of approach all aspects of our life
Mm-hmm.
as a portal to these deeper layers of understanding, because
Mm-hmm.
to me it's like, oh, how interesting, control is coming up again.
Yeah.
It doesn't put me out of dysregulation. When you mentioned that the lead rope was a bit tight on Mystery yesterday, I
Yeah.
wasn't like, oh my god, like I need to fix this,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
like, oh shoot, here it is again.
Yeah.
Like it didn't put me into a different sense of like dysregulation
Uh-huh.
like it might have,
Yeah.
or a younger version of me might have also thought like, oh, she's judging me.
Oh no.
But now it's like, oh, hi friend,
Uh-huh.
hi, I see you there.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
Here's another way that we can approach this,
Yeah.
and can we allow for surrender here? Can
Yeah.
we allow for invitation here? Can we allow for this other being
Yeah.
that has an autonomous body, has
Yeah.
an autonomous soul, to make a decision and be in a co-creative relationship
Yeah.
instead of in a controlling relationship?
It occurs to me that you've maybe chosen for yourself an absolute masterclass for your own shadow of control,
Mm-hmm.
because there are few creatures, I mean, there's lots of them on the list I'm about to name, but there are few creatures that have less of a history of techniques of control
Mm-hmm.
than horses.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
I mean, they've been are co-evolutionary partners in this building of civilization,
Yeah.
of war making, of agriculture, of conquest, of colonization.
Yeah.
We have so many techniques to control them. And so if you wanted to exercise your control shadow, you've picked a great animal too,
Right.
but you haven't chosen to do it
Right.
in the mainstream frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
You've chosen to do it in the soft
Yeah.
frameworks. So this is a real master
Yeah.
class because it's like I could control them,
Yeah.
but I don't want to.
Yeah.
And I already know enough about nervous systems to know when our human friends, quickly I'll just say, like, when I hear about your survival strategy of control, I suspect you're probably very good at it, and it's probably a very good service
Mm-hmm.
to the beings around you,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't even be seen as an violation.
Yeah.
It might even be welcomed
Mm-hmm.
as like a, oh, thank God you're here. And yet, nonetheless, once we bring that question of consent and we
Mm-hmm.
even talk about words like codependency or enmeshment, it's like just because I've been given permission to control, once I know about things like consent and agency and like enmeshment,
Yeah.
in the animal world or in the horse world, the animal will physically start to lean on you
Mm-hmm.
if you create the equivalent of a codependent relationship. They'll physically lean
Yeah.
on you. So we have terms like self-carriage, which is a physical biomechanical term,
Mm-hmm.
trying to teach them to carry their own weight in
Mm-hmm.
relation with their human partner.
Mm-hmm.
If you ever watch like Olympic equestrian stuff, you'll see, if you have a refined enough eye for it, there's so much micromanagement going on the handler side, especially in dressage. Although that realm claims to be all about self-carriage,
Mm-hmm.
which would be our energetics of like autonomy,
Sure.
it's actually not.
Yeah.
And I go further in my teachings to talk about not just physical self-carriage, although I'm very invested in that,
Mm-hmm.
meaning, you're talking about the tightness on the rope.
Mm-hmm.
Could we soften the rope?
Yeah.
Look, Ma, no hands. And nothing changes in either your balance or the horse's balance.
Right.
But furthermore, is there emotional self-carriage?
Mm-hmm.
So am I always working with them in a way where even if my control impulses are being applied for the betterment of all,
Mm-hmm.
it's like give a man a fish, teach a man a fish.
Mm-hmm.
If I have any control tendencies now in my newer version of myself, want to be using those in the modeling form.
Yeah.
And of course, by then they're not control anymore,
Yeah.
to show them how they can stand up on their own
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, meaning like, can I ask them to do something? They start to do it, they start to dysregulate. I work with their thresholds in a sensitive enough way that I'm always building resilience so that what the end product isn't just, hey, look, Ma, all these crazy tricks I can get my horse to do.
Right.
Isn't it so cool? They can pirouette and flying lead changes and
Yeah.
jump 6 feet jumps. That's not what it's about. It's like, hey, look, I'd be content with a walk
Mm-hmm.
from a horse that looks balanced, where maybe I'm even sitting on them,
Mm-hmm.
but I am my own entity. They are their own entity. We are two bodies in conversation, but I'm not holding them together.
Yeah.
And the more I back off from control, but we're still there in
Yeah.
physical relationship, they don't panic.
Yeah.
And in fact, if something even comes into the environment that causes momentary dysregulation, I'm looking for that resilient nervous system that goes, yeah,
Yeah.
no big deal. We
Yeah.
can go up, gets a little wily.
Yeah.
Maybe I even, co-regulate for a moment, and then they come down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we see that life in their eye.
Yeah.
We see bodies that know how to like have big movements and it
Mm-hmm.
not be a cause for like, this is a traumatic thing.
Right.
This is like the sky is falling. They can have big expressive movements. They can be who they are. They might need a little assistance from me to come down off of that, but then I back off. I say, you're good.
Yeah.
So that's the measure there.
Yeah.
So it occurs to me, you're here in the master class with the horses,
Yeah. And to
your
me, it's
journey.
also like this is how I speak about my practitioner-client relationships.
Mm,
Is, I come from a very medicalized background
mm,
of, you know, I don't know if you have any, connection with the fertility world, but that was
mm.
the world that I worked in.
Oh,
And
wow.
it was like, let's control women's hormones, let's
Mm,
regulate things like to the minutia.
mm-hmm,
And here are all the supplements you have to take, here are all
mm.
the prescriptions you have to take. Fauna has some very strong feelings about this. I agree with you.
Yeah, these mayors know a little bit about this stuff.
And um and actually I've found, and back in my days of working in fertility medicine, I'd have clients who'd come in with a literal shopping bag full of supplements
Mm,
and prescription medications.
mm-hmm.
And my job would be like, actually, let's release a little bit.
Yeah.
Can we safely let go of some of these things?
Mm-hmm.
Because what I'm feeling in this moment energetically is this like this clenching down.
Mm.
And of course fertility can't express itself in that moment, because fertility is this expression of creation and flow, like all
Backing
these.
off of to
Yeah,
our in getting into our 50% so that
exactly.
nature can start to speak its language.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so, I think of that a lot in my practitioner client relationships
Mm,
of like, how can I word this one question
mm.
in a way that they then take that momentum and can have that internal conversation with
Oh,
themselves,
yeah.
instead of me needing to always be right there for them,
Mm,
you know? And I think that that is what true empowerment
yeah.
is if I can show you that actually you're so much wiser, client,
Mm-hmm. Wow.
than I even know.
Yeah.
And so my role then becomes, here's a cue, and
Yeah.
let me back off
Right.
and let me see what
Yeah.
happens. And it's okay if you get dysregulated,
Yeah.
because I'm going to be right here to hold you
Mm-hmm.
in that dysregulation, but you're still doing that work yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that a lot of, if I can have one big criticism of the coaching industry, of the
Mm-hmm.
helping, professional world,
Yeah.
this is the thing, which is, did our clients actually consent to having you come into their space
Mm-hmm.
and take over their lives
Mm-hmm.
and mandate, these are the things you need to take, these are the exercises you have to do, these are the
Yeah.
exact journaling questions you have to choose, like,
Yeah.
did they consent to being prescribed,
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
and I think that that's kind of what I'm hearing mirrored
Yeah.
in your relationship with horses,
Yeah.
is that self-carriage.
Yeah.
Same thing in humans, it's just the self-carriage looks different.
It's a whole different model, I think, for us understanding, especially those of us on the like healing arts side of things, the more compassionate side of things, to recognize the ways in which control creeps into care. And that just because you're doing something in the name of care doesn't justify that level of control,
Mm-hmm.
because it denies the wisdom of the body. It denies the wisdom of the, in the cases you're talking about, the patient,
Mm-hmm.
so, and I imagine this happens as much as it does in the holistic healing as
Mm-hmm.
it does in allopathic healing.
Absolutely.
Because just because you've traded out, well, it's not pharma, it's
A
whatever,
green smoothie.
a green smoothie, doesn't mean you're not still acting with that same. And this is a subtle, subtle distinction. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, that pulling back, I think, will feel for some people like abandonment
Mm-hmm.
on both sides. Like maybe, ooh, in me pulling back and not controlling everything for my other, whatever my other is, patient, horse, partner, whoever, on the person who's pulling back side might feel like, oh God, like this pulling back feels like I'm abandoning them.
Mm.
And even on the side of the person who's, if they're used to care that feels like control, if they're used to
Mm-hmm.
codependent relationships, that's going to feel like, where are you?
Yeah. And
I only know you as like being in me,
yeah.
in my whole energy
Yeah.
field. What is it even to be me
Yeah.
in relation with you
Yeah.
when you're over there and
Mm-hmm.
I'm here?
Yeah.
And so there's like an education process there.
And this is where I think communication is so important. This is
Mm,
where I think it's so important as the practitioner to hold your center.
mm,
And even if the client feels abandoned, recognize that it's actually not about you. And
mm,
your role is then to create a safe space so that they have a disconfirming experience, because if they have an abandonment wound,
mm-hmm.
here it is coming up again. And can you create a different experience for them so that they feel safe in the space that's created between two autonomous people?
Yeah, and what comes up for me there is like, okay, so in that moment where the practitioner is, let's say someone's listening to this podcast and this sounds a bit like me.
Mm-hmm.
I have a little inflection of control in my care practice.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to pull back. And let's say in that situation, either party feels like, ooh, this feels like a familiar kind of abandonment feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But here's where the difference is. And this is going back to the idea of modeling nervous systems. So while it might feel like a similar kind of abandonment experience, because, ooh, there's distance,
Mm-hmm.
what would feel very different if we were to really feel into our bodies is that, yes, there might be distance, but that distance isn't one that's filled with the coldness of
Mm-hmm.
like withdrawal or
Yeah.
even the dysregulation of the one who did the abandoning
Yeah.
was doing the abandoning
Yeah.
because they were dysregulated.
Right.
It's a very different feeling
Mm-hmm.
if we tune into it and
Yeah.
we on both parties sides withdraw for the sake of nurturing the other being's agency,
Mm-hmm.
even though they might not be used to flexing that muscle. But then tune into there is not the coldness of a dysregulating withdrawal.
Yeah.
There's an open space.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where these beautiful terms like holding space,
Mm-hmm.
container,
Mm-hmm.
which have become a bit overused, but I still love them
Mm-hmm.
because, like, that is space
Mm-hmm.
that isn't non abandonment type
Yeah.
space. There's a fullness to the feeling
Yeah.
of distance.
Yeah.
And it might take some getting used to, again, for both party sides.
Mm-hmm.
I know it. I know that felt sense with horses.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still working on it in the human
Yeah.
realm. And I know you've helped me remember, like, you know this with horses.
Mm-hmm.
Use that memory that your nervous system has
Yeah.
of that feeling
Yeah.
of a kind of distance that isn't the coldness and dysregulation of withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's a
Mm-hmm.
it's a it's like what a home feels like.
Yeah.
It's a container.
Yeah.
There's space for me to be me,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a fullness
Yeah.
to it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I feel like we're kind of on parallel paths here,
Hmm.
because I feel like I have the language and the technique and the skills to do it with humans,
Yeah.
and I'm now learning how to do it with horses, and it's like opposites, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that,
That's
you know,
great.
I love learning from you
Yeah.
and learning alongside you,
Yeah.
and I so appreciate our friendship, our colleague
Yeah.
relationship, our, you know, I think that it's a mutually beneficial and reciprocal one on this side.
Yeah. And of course, like the feedback we get back too, it's like even from, you say you might know the human side more and I know the horse side more. It's still like in that reverb back and forth, I still am bringing lessons like, "Ooh, I could still do some tweaks more with the horses."
Yeah,
Or I kind of had it once and then we get dysregulated and we lose some of
yeah,
that and
yeah,
like go back and refine it.
yeah.
So it's a very beautiful thing. And
Mm-hmm.
thank you for that and all
Mm-hmm.
these beautiful reverbs and reflections.
Yeah.
And you can see, hopefully, other people can see that the horses are very much soaking, not only soaking into, but perhaps even
Just being
creating
just
some
being
of
here. Yeah.
some of this with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also just want to name that, like, I know that you hold your relationship with your horses in such a sacred way. And so, thank you so much for inviting me into your world, this
Hmm.
beautiful land that you are stewarding.
Hmm.
The fact that I got to play with mystery the last 2 days has been just such a delight, and just wonderful lessons abound. And so,
My
thank you
letting
so
go
much.
edge is the letting go edge of letting other people be in deep relationship with my animals. It's a polyamory of like
Yeah.
horse human stuff.
Yeah.
So
So,
it's great.
so I
The thanks
appreciate
goes
the
both
trust.
ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how can people find you, my dear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just happened to be taking a sip of water here with my
Yeah.
logo showing. Humminghorse.com is my website. And I do a lot of posting on Instagram, humminghorse underscore equestrian on Instagram. And for those that might be listening that maybe aren't really into horses too much, hopefully you'll still see there's content that's very relevant to both horse
Absolutely.
and human nervous systems, emotional experiences, spiritual experiences. I also have a course called Cleaning Up the Contact Zone, which is accessible through both of those portals, both my website and my Instagram account, if
Hmm.
anyone's interested.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just want to continue to highlight this piece is like even before I had my little herd to work with,
Mm-hmm.
um, I was just consuming your words. You just
Mm-hmm.
have a really beautiful poetry and a way of looking at the world that is not just horse centric,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually relational centric and nervous system centric. And
Mm-hmm.
so even if you don't have a horse friend to sort of do these experimentations with, I
Mm-hmm.
find it really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And Asha has things to she wants to like yell your website at the top of her lungs
Yeah,
here.
that's totally what she's doing. Bob Barker over here.
Yeah. And your course too, I
Mm-hmm.
think for anybody who's even if you are an experienced
Mm-hmm.
horse person,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like I know how to lead a horse. You
Mm-hmm.
taught me a different way to lead a horse yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there's these ways in which we can be in relationship with horses that is so fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you've been in the horse world for decades, I think that there's a lot to learn
Mm-hmm.
from your work because there's I stayed away from horse world because I didn't realize that there was a different way
Mm-hmm.
for the longest time. I
Mm-hmm.
thought it was just kicking and spurs and doing this and
Mm-hmm.
and so if you can come in with an open mind
Mm-hmm.
and just soak in.
Be willing to have things shaken up a little bit.
Yeah.
And what I hope too, and I mean, I know that some people, I mean, the course is like work at your own pace. And so I get different emails from some of the students that are at various spots in the course. And even kind of like changing reactions to the course. Like, oh, I was kind of thinking this exercise, that the point of it was this,
Hmm.
but I stuck with it and I've been doing it a little bit longer and now like epiphany, I
Yeah.
realize now it actually does this thing. And I'm so grateful for those students that are in the course that are recognizing that the teachings that are encapsulated in that course, you know, some of the lessons are only 15, 20 minutes long
Hmm.
and they show footage, me working with actual horses, sometimes me working with actual students and horses. But the teachings that are in there are supposed to be like power bomb truths, so that even though they might be only 15, 20 minutes, you might watch them over and over again, or you might practice those exercises over and over again with your own animals or your own relationships, and new insights will come out over
Yeah.
time. So I'm always grateful for the people that might even come in with some skepticism. I don't blame them. There's so much hardened kind of like, this is how it is in the horse
Hmm.
world. Um, and they're willing to be opened up by it even a little bit.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I just love just this concept of rippling trauma informed practices into every, you know,
Ah,
space,
mm-hmm.
every service providing space. And this is,
Everything should be
yeah,
trauma informed.
this is a space that's needed it for a very, very long time. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for doing this work.
yeah. Thanks for receiving it, and thanks for helping to share it with other people.
Yeah.
Mm,
Thanks, Shannon.
yeah.